There's a problem with the headline everyone wants to believe about D.B. Cooper. After more than 50 years, a piece of evidence really did contain DNA. The FBI really did recover a genetic sample from the famous black tie left behind on the plane. New suspects really have been put forward. New FBI files have really been released, and investigators and private researchers really have tried to use modern genetics to reopen questions that seemed impossible to answer in 1971. But there is one sentence you should not believe yet. D.B. Cooper has not been definitively identified. The FBI still considers the case unresolved, and the DNA recovered from the tie has never publicly produced a confirmed identity. That does not make the story less fascinating. It makes it more dangerous, because after half a century, the smallest clue can suddenly look like the final answer. And right now, one suspect, one family, and one piece of DNA are once again pulling the world's attention back toward the man who stepped off a Boeing 727 with a parachute, $200,000, and no intention of ever being seen again. The story begins on November 24th, 1971, Thanksgiving Eve in the United States. A man walked into Portland International Airport and bought a one-way ticket to Seattle. He gave the name Dan Cooper. That detail matters because the name D.B. Cooper was not actually what the hijacker called himself. The famous version came from a press mistake made after the hijacking, and the incorrect name stuck. He boarded Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 and took a seat near the rear of the Boeing 727. He was described as a man in his mid-40s, wearing a dark business suit, white shirt, and black tie. He ordered a bourbon and soda and behaved like an ordinary businessman. For a few minutes, there was nothing remarkable about him at all. Then he handed a flight attendant a note and quietly told her she should read it. Inside the briefcase he showed her was what appeared to be a bomb. He demanded $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. The hijacking had begun. The strange thing about Cooper was not that he was loud or violent. It was almost the opposite. He was calm. He released all 36 passengers once the aircraft reached Seattle and the money and parachutes were delivered. He kept only a small group of crew members aboard. Then he gave them another set of instructions. He wanted the plane to head toward Mexico City, but at an unusually low altitude and relatively slow speed. The aircraft was to remain unpressurized, and the rear air stair needed to remain usable. The Boeing 727 was unusual because the aircraft had a retractable staircase at the rear, allowing someone to exit from behind the engines. Cooper either knew about that feature in advance or understood enough about the aircraft to exploit it. The pilots eventually took off again, somewhere between Seattle and Reno, a little after 8 p.m. The crew felt a change in the aircraft. The rear stairs had been lowered. Cooper was gone. The plane landed in Reno, Nevada, and agents immediately entered the aircraft. What they found looked almost absurdly ordinary. Cooper had disappeared, but he had not erased every trace of himself. There were parachutes. There was the missing ransom. There were cigarette butts and other small pieces of evidence. And there was the black clip-on tie he had been wearing. That tie became one of the most important objects in the investigation. Cooper had apparently removed it before the jump and left it behind. The FBI eventually obtained DNA from the tie, but that DNA did not provide a clean name. It became one of the case's most valuable clues and one of its most misunderstood. The FBI's own historical page confirms that the tie later provided a DNA sample, but it does not identify the source profile as belonging to any confirmed suspect. And that distinction is crucial, because for years the public has been hearing versions of the story that sound much more definitive than the evidence really is. A DNA sample is not automatically a DNA identification. A genetic profile can tell investigators that biological material is present. It may even allow comparison against a suspect. But if nobody can establish whose DNA it is, or if the sample is incomplete, contaminated, or difficult to interpret, the result is a clue rather than a conclusion. The Cooper tie has precisely that problem. Investigators have never publicly announced a DNA match that establishes the hijacker's identity beyond serious doubt. Several suspects over the decades have even been eliminated by DNA comparisons. One famous example involved Dwayne Weber, a man who claimed on his deathbed to have been Cooper. His DNA did not match the profile from the tie. Another Cooper claimant, Lynn Doyle Cooper, was also not supported by DNA evidence. Then there is the question that has haunted the case from the beginning. Did Cooper survive the jump? The FBI never found him. They also never recovered the majority of the ransom. They never found the parachute he used. They never found a body. And that absence became the fuel that kept the mystery alive. The conditions were brutal. Cooper jumped at night into severe weather over the rugged Pacific Northwest, wearing clothing that was not designed for parachuting into a winter storm. He was carrying the ransom and apparently had little ability to control exactly where he would land. The FBI conducted extensive searches and never found a body. The agency eventually concluded that many scenarios were possible, including that Cooper may have died in the jump. But the evidence never reached a definitive conclusion either way. The man simply vanished. Then, 9 years later, The case produced one of its most famous clues. In 1980, a young boy found 3 packets of $20 bills buried along the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington. The bills were badly deteriorated, but the serial numbers matched the ransom money. The total was $5,800. It was the only portion of the $200,000 ever recovered. The discovery was genuine and immediately sent investigators back into the mystery. Why were those bills there? Were they deliberately buried? Had river movement transported them? Could Cooper have survived and hidden part of the ransom? Or had the money reached the river through some other route? The discovery proved that at least part of the ransom had physically reached the area, but it did not reveal who put it there. The FBI still lists those recovered bills as part of the core evidence in the case. That one discovery created a strange paradox. It proved that the ransom existed somewhere beyond the airplane, but instead of shrinking the mystery, it expanded it. Investigators could map theories around the location of the money, but the rest of the fortune never appeared. If Cooper had survived and kept the money, why was almost all of it never spent? If he died, why was the rest never found? If the money had been buried intentionally, why there? And why were there only 3 packets? More than 40 years after the cash was found, these questions still do not have a universally accepted answer. The FBI's investigation became enormous. The agency interviewed witnesses, pursued hundreds of leads, examined numerous suspects, and maintained the case for decades. Cooper became one of the most famous unsolved crimes in American history. And unlike many mysteries, the public became part of the investigation. Thousands of people proposed theories. Families accused relatives. Former military personnel were examined. Skydivers were scrutinized. Airline employees became suspects. People confessed. People claimed their fathers had done it. People claimed their brothers had done it. Some had elaborate stories. Others had nothing more than a resemblance to a police sketch. None produced the final proof required by investigators. One of the most persistent suspects has been Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. The reason he became so interesting is that McCoy was later convicted of hijacking an airplane in April 1972, only a few months after the Cooper crime. He also used parachuting as part of his escape plan. On the surface, the similarities are astonishing. Here was a man with aviation and parachuting experience who hijacked a plane and jumped with ransom money. It looked almost like the same crime had been repeated. But similarity is not identity. The FBI investigated McCoy and did not officially conclude that he was Cooper. In recent years, however, McCoy's children have revived the theory, claiming that their father was the man behind the 1971 hijacking. They have pointed to family statements, an alleged parachute discovered decades later, and other circumstantial evidence. The McCoy story became particularly prominent in late 2024, and again in 2026, because his children claimed that their mother, Karen McCoy, had confessed that she helped plan the Cooper hijacking. According to a report published in 2026, Richard McCoy III said he received the revelation from his mother and later provided DNA material to the FBI in hopes that a genetic comparison could finally settle the question. But this is where the story needs careful handling. A family confession is not equivalent to forensic confirmation. The FBI has not publicly confirmed McCoy as Cooper, and the central problem remains the same. The evidence has to connect McCoy directly to the physical evidence from Flight 305. That is the reason DNA has become so important. Because unlike a witness who remembers a face 50 years later, DNA can potentially provide a much more objective comparison. If researchers can establish a reliable genetic profile from Cooper's evidence and compare it with an unquestionably known sample from a suspect, then suddenly the entire debate changes. A positive match could eliminate decades of speculation. A mismatch could kill a famous theory permanently. But the quality and provenance of the sample matter enormously. Where exactly did the genetic material come from? How many people's DNA is present? Was the tie handled during the original investigation? Are the recovered markers sufficient for a powerful comparison? How much of the profile can be interpreted confidently? These are the questions that stand between interesting clue and case solved. The tie is fascinating precisely because of where it touched Cooper's body. It was a clip-on tie rather than a traditional necktie. The FBI says Cooper was wearing a black J, C penny tie, and removed it before jumping. Over time, researchers examining the tie found evidence of biological material and particles. Some private investigators have claimed that those particles may reveal something about Cooper's occupation, particularly because unusual industrial materials have reportedly been identified. But once again, caution matters. A particle can tell investigators something about an environment. It does not automatically tell them the identity of the person who touched it. A tie travels through the world. It can pick up contaminants from clothing, furniture, vehicles, workplaces, and other people. That makes particle analysis useful, but not magically specific. This is where the new version of the Cooper mystery becomes more interesting than the old one. The old question was, which famous suspect is Cooper? The better question is, what evidence can actually distinguish one suspect from another? A suspect who looks like the sketch is weak evidence. A suspect who knows how to skydive is stronger. A suspect with access to Boeing aircraft is interesting. A suspect who suddenly disappeared after the hijacking is intriguing. A suspect who possesses unexplained money is more interesting still. But a documented DNA match to the biological evidence from the aircraft would be in an entirely different category. That is why modern genealogy has become such a powerful tool in cold cases. Investigators no longer need to find a suspect directly. In some cases, they can identify distant relatives of an unknown person and then build a family tree backward and sideways until a plausible individual emerges. But this method requires a sufficiently reliable genetic profile, and the reference database has to contain useful relatives. In a case as old as Cooper's, even a partial profile can be difficult to interpret. A degraded genetic signal may not contain enough information to distinguish one family from another. Contamination becomes another problem. Every person who handles the evidence potentially leaves biological material behind. So the idea that DNA has confirmed D.B. Cooper goes further than the public evidence allows. What DNA has done is something less dramatic but still important. It has given investigators a biological clue that can be used to test suspects. And that is exactly what happened with some earlier claims. When a suspect's DNA failed to match the evidence, the theory became much weaker. This is how science should work. DNA is more valuable as an elimination tool than as a magical identity machine when the sample is incomplete. The FBI's position also matters. The Bureau officially redirected its resources away from the active Cooper investigation in 2016, saying that repeated tips and new technology had failed to produce the proof needed to identify the hijacker. The case was not declared solved. It was effectively moved into a different category. The FBI made clear that if specific physical evidence related to the parachutes or ransom emerged, investigators would consider it. That means the government has never treated one public suspect theory as a confirmed answer. As recently released files have shown, the case remains full of leads, contradictions, and unanswered questions. Newly released FBI files have added context but have not produced the missing final chapter. Documents released in 2025 revealed additional details about the investigation, the suspect pool, and the way investigators evaluated the evidence. But the release did not suddenly produce a verified name. That is important because the public often assumes that declassification equals solution. It does not. Opening old files can reveal what agents believed, what they ruled out, what they overlooked, or how uncertain they were. It can make the historical picture clearer without making the criminal identity any clearer. And then there is the haunting possibility that Cooper did not survive. If that is true, the entire modern search for his identity is searching for a dead man who may have left only biological traces and scattered physical evidence. Imagine the problem from the investigator's perspective. There is no living suspect. There is no confession. There is no bank account suddenly appearing. There may not even be descendants who know they are connected to him. The search becomes archaeological. Researchers are trying to reconstruct one human being from objects left behind for a few hours in 1971. That is why the tie is so important. It is almost the perfect piece of evidence for the case. It belonged to him. It remained behind. And modern science can interrogate it in ways investigators in 1971 could never have imagined. But there's also an irony. The more technology advances, the more people want the tie to speak with absolute certainty. Science does not always work that way. Sometimes the evidence becomes clearer and still refuses to produce a name. The public wants one suspect. Scientists want a chain of evidence. Those are not the same thing. A photograph can make someone look like Cooper. A parachute can look like Cooper's. A relative can believe a father was Cooper. A confession can sound convincing. A family story can survive for decades. But none of these independently establishes identity. That is why the strongest possible ending to the story would be a direct forensic match between reliable Cooper DNA and a known suspect. Anything less is a theory, however compelling, and there are still fascinating suspects. Richard McCoy remains one of the strongest in terms of skill similarities. Robert Rackstraw was another highly publicized theory, supported by private investigators and documentaries, but never accepted as proven. Kenneth Christensen has been proposed by family members and researchers. Lynn Doyle Cooper was named by a relative, and ultimately not supported by DNA evidence. Dwayne Weber made a deathbed confession and was also eliminated by DNA. The sheer number of suspects demonstrates how badly the public wants the mystery to have an ending. But consider what the real Cooper did, assuming the FBI's evidence and witness descriptions are broadly accurate. He selected a specific aircraft. He understood how to use its rear staircase. He made demands that were technically difficult, but operationally possible. He carried himself calmly under intense pressure. He demanded 4 parachutes, a clever move, because authorities could not know whether he planned to force another person to jump with him. He ordered a low-altitude, slow-speed flight, and then he jumped into the night. Whether he survived remains one of the central mysteries. If he died, the decision to jump was catastrophically reckless. If he survived, he achieved something almost unbelievable. And if he survived, he then had another problem: the money. $200,000 in 1971 was an enormous sum, equivalent to well over $1 million today, depending on the inflation measure used. But only $5,800 ever surfaced. No verified Cooper fortune appeared later. That suggests one of several possibilities. He could have died with the remaining cash. The money could have been lost. It could still be buried somewhere. Or Cooper may never have reached the money in a usable way. Every scenario has problems. The Columbia River money makes the mystery even stranger. Why those bills? Why that location? Why those bundles? Why only that amount? The answer might be physical rather than intentional. River systems can move material, sediment can bury objects, and landscapes change dramatically over years. But because the cache carried unique serial numbers, its discovery remains the strongest physical confirmation that some of the ransom entered the environment outside the plane. And then the case becomes something bigger than the identity of one man. It becomes a study in evidence. It shows how memory changes. It shows how legends grow. It shows how families reinterpret the past. It shows how new technologies can resurrect old questions. And it shows how dangerous a seductive story can become when every coincidence gets treated as proof. The latest claims surrounding Richard McCoy are fascinating precisely because they offer something testable. If a definitive genetic comparison can be made and published with enough detail to establish a reliable match, then the case could change overnight. But until such a result is independently verified, the responsible position is to keep the claim where it belongs: possible, intriguing, unresolved. That may frustrate anyone hoping for a dramatic final scene, but it is also what makes the investigation credible, because the goal is not to find the most exciting answer. The goal is to find the correct one. And after 53 years, perhaps the biggest misconception about D.B. Cooper is that the mystery has been solved many times already. It has not. It has produced many suspects, many confessions, many theories, many books, many documentaries, many supposedly decisive clues, but none has produced the final standard required to say, without qualification, this was the man. The DNA is part of that story, but it has not yet delivered the verdict. The tie is real. The profile is real. The questions are real. The newly released files are real. The McCoy family's claims are real. But none of those facts by themselves turns a possibility into identity. And perhaps that is why this mystery has survived longer than almost any other American aviation crime. D.B. Cooper exists in a strange space between history and folklore. We know exactly when he appeared. We know approximately how long he was visible. We know what he demanded. We know what he wore. We know what he left behind. We know the airplane. We know the route. We know the weather. We even know the ransom serial numbers. But we don't know the man. For about 5 hours, he was a real person sitting on a commercial airplane. After that, he had an idea, a silhouette in a police sketch, a name that was never really his, a black tie inside an evidence bag, a few $1,000s buried beside a river, a mountain of suspects. And now, more than half a century later, a genetic clue that may eventually tell us something about the throat that once wore that tie. Maybe the answer is Richard McCoy. Maybe it is someone else entirely. Maybe the DNA points toward a family that has never appeared in the Cooper story. Or maybe the tie will never yield enough information to give us a name. But that uncertainty is exactly where the evidence stands today. And the most honest headline is, therefore, not DNA confirmed D.B. Cooper. It is this: the DNA gave investigators another door. They just haven't opened the right one yet. Because somewhere between Portland, Seattle, Reno, the Columbia River, and the dark forests of Washington, one man disappeared. The FBI stopped actively hunting him years ago. The public never stopped. And as long as that tie remains in evidence, as long as the genetic material can still be analyzed, as long as the ransom serial numbers remain known, and as long as families continue uncovering stories about men who suddenly behaved strangely after November 24th, 1971, the Cooper case is not completely dead. It is only waiting for the one piece of evidence that does what all the others failed to do. Please do not modify it, not resembled, not sound convincing. Prove